All right. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining our first session in our governance series with Michael Weiland. This session is Board Governance 101, but we also have two other sessions in this series. April 22nd will focus on conflict of interest, and then May 13th will be on the topic of fiduciary duty. So just a reminder before we begin, and it's also on the screen, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A. Also, this session is approved for South Dakota Nursing Home Administrator credits. And in order to meet the regulatory and education requirements, participants receiving credits must stay for the entire event, and attendance is recorded. Also, I'd like to share with you too just a few other education topics that we have coming up in the month of April. April 1, we have a workplace violence prevention awareness at 11 a.m. We also have secondary traumatic stress, April 6th at 1 p.m. Patient-provider communication more than meets the eye, that's April 8th. Ligature risk and suicide, April 13th. And then South Dakota Workforce Innovations for Recruitment and Retention Programs is April 15th. So if you have not signed up for those yet, you can either go to our website, SDAHO.org, or if you're part of the education participant portal, you can also go there and sign up, and it will be no cost to those facilities that purchase the education package. So at this time, I would like to introduce and welcome our guest speaker and board expert, Michael Weiland. Michael Weiland has over 30 years of experience in corporate and government public policy, management, and administration. He is an expert on nonprofit governance and fundraising issues. He has been featured just in a number of media publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, and several others. He is currently serving as an editorial advisory board member and contributor to the Nonprofit Quarterly, with more than 400 articles and features published since 2012. So Michael Weiland, thank you for being here today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. We're going to go through the basics of board service over the next hour. My plan is to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then leave plenty of time for questions, either during the presentation or definitely at the end. If you have questions along the way, please type them into the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll handle them when it seems most appropriate, and I will defer to to you about when that is. Everyone will be getting a copy of the slides, so please don't feel like you have to take notes. My slides break most of the rules of PowerPoint. They are full of text. There's a lot of information that I'm going to cover because there's a lot to board service. Don't worry about it. You'll have another chance to review the information as it goes by. The final thing I'm going to say is that the presentation was initially developed for board members, that this was board orientation, board training. And I know that there are a lot of people here today who are not board members, but rather are staff or even CEOs. And I've been a CEO, so I can talk about working with a nonprofit board from that perspective as well. And I'll try to insert some comments from time to time about what things might look like from a staff perspective or a CEO perspective, as well as from the board member perspective. But please ask your questions, even if you might have differing viewpoints. I would really love to hear that, because a lot of this is not set in stone. A lot of it is subject to interpretation. So, please, you're not going to offend me. You're not going to put me off. And there are no silly questions. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. See if that works. Are we
Yep,
good to go?
I can see your screen. You're good to go.
Great. Now let's see here. There we go. Okay, this is the slide where I tell you how great I am. We'll get over that because we handled most of that already. this is an example of a pocket guide that we wrote about 10 years ago. It's very important about talking about board member responsibilities. And it just says board membership will in part be what you make of it. The more involved and invested you become in leadership of the organization you serve, the more benefit and reward you'll achieve. Boards often go undeveloped in part because it's natural to respond only to expectations. And I'm going to stop here and say that's especially true for volunteers. You show up in a boardroom as a new board member and you're looking to see what the landscape looks like, what your role and level of participation is supposed to be, and you're really looking for cues from the other people in the room. And my point here is to say that you need to get comfortable with the idea that as a board member, you are a leader of the organization, that you are the one who is ultimately responsible for the organization's success or failure, and how and whether it meets its mission successfully. So, don't get used to taking a back seat. Don't get used to being reactive. Become active as a board member. And your board service will be a lot more satisfying and a lot more successful if you remember that you're an active part of the leadership because you are the leader, among the leaders of the organization. Everything I'm about to say in the next half hour or so relates around the two words fiduciary duty. And a lot of people hear that term and they kind of fog over in their mind because they think it has something to do with money and balance sheets and audits and financial reports, and that's just not where they are. So, but fiduciary duty simply means taking care of something that belongs to someone else and putting their interests ahead of your own. The something can be tangible or intangible, but regardless, a fiduciary takes care of it. And we'll have a separate session on fiduciary duty where we dive down a little deeper into this, but the important thing is that it's not just about the money, it's not just about the land, it's not just about the buildings. Among the fiduciary duty a board member has is the fiduciary duty to the mission itself, the fiduciary duty to the brand and the brand promise of the organization they serve. That can be customer service, patient care, the morale of employees. All of that is part of what comes under the fiduciary duty of a board member, because you are taking care of everything that is an asset that the organization might have to use in meeting its mission. And everything we talk about in these duties or these functions of a board is related in one way or another to fiduciary duty. I've identified 10 functions. And yeah, if you're a board member, you're going to be doing a lot of different things. And I think most of your experience as a board member will come in to one of these 10 functions. And I think that if you're a staff member, it'll be pretty easy to see that the board's duties are widely varied, and that that what you do as a staff member is reflected in what the board oversight is. This doesn't mean the board micromanages and does your work for you, or comes in and meddles with the details, but they do have a responsibility for oversight. But the most important thing the board does is not about operations. It really is about strategy. It's about vision. And an effective board determines the mission and purpose of the organization. That is specifically the board's role in the organization. Any nonprofit organization, particularly, and most of the hospitals in South Dakota are 501c3 charitable organizations. Sanford, Avera, Monument, most of the community hospitals in the state are 501c3 organizations. They are charitable, tax exempt as identified by the IRS. And in a nonprofit organization, it is the board that's responsible for the mission, vision, values, goals, and strategic priorities of the organization. Now, the board needs to seek the input of constituencies to determine the direction, and that includes getting information from staff and staff leaders. You assess program activities against the mission. Are we doing the right things? And are we doing enough of the right things? And are we, stopping doing the wrong things. We require benchmarks of progress, and we communicate directly to the community regarding the mission and goals of the organization. Now, many of you might be aware that you're already doing a community health needs assessment and a report out to the community as just one way of talking about the needs of the community and how your hospital is responding to those needs. But there are a lot of ways that the board directly can communicate with the community about the successes and the need areas for the hospital on whose board they serve. The next the board selects and evaluates the chief administrator, the CEO. The board hires the CEO. And it's the board as a whole. It's not the executive committee. It's not the nominating committee. It's not the board chair. Every member of the board shares legal responsibility and legal liability for the actions of the board. So the entire board should be involved in key processes like the recruiting and hiring of the CEO. That doesn't mean the whole board should interview every candidate. It doesn't mean the whole board has to sit to identify salary, compensation, et cetera. But what it means is the board has to have good information and ultimately approve the selection made by the nominating committee and approve the contracts, that employ that CEO. So you're working together to identify the characteristics you want, take an active role in developing a clear job description for the chief executive, because there are at least 2 job descriptions for a CEO. There's the one that we could all almost dictate, saying, well, the CEO is responsible for everything having to do with the organization, and oh, by the way, they coordinate with the board. But really, the responsibilities in an organization have a lot to do with where the hospital is in its life cycle. Is it a growing hospital? Is it a hospital in crisis that needs to be turned around? Is the hospital part of a system, and the CEO's role is at least as much a liaison with the mothership, as it is, supervising and leading the operations, of the organization locally. Those have a lot of influence on what type of person you hire. So it's important to take a look at the leadership role through a variety of lenses, including that of the traditional job description. To decide how the recruitment and selection process will be done, develop a process to compare each candidate, and make sure it's a fair arm's length process, and to assure that the selected candidate has reviewed and agreed to the board's annual or semi-annual review process before extending an offer, because you want someone who is unafraid to say, yes, I'm going to come in and I'm going to recognize you have a strategic plan, and yes, I'm willing to be graded, in effect, evaluated against the success of implementing that plan. A board member needs to support the executive. It doesn't mean that they do whatever the executive says in a passive kind of way, but what it means is that the CEO is there to help the organization be successful, and the board should enable that success as much as possible. So you provide consistent moral and substantive support. You keep in touch with the executive. The executive should be keeping in touch with you, but if you don't hear from the executive, reach out to him or her and just say, hey, I want to hear what's going on. How are you doing? How is the organization doing? What do you need from the board? If the only time you see the CEO or hear from the CEO is at board meetings, then you probably need to touch base a little more often. Board members should stay involved in the formal performance appraisal. That doesn't mean they have to do it, but it means they should make sure that the formal performance appraisal is done. A lot of times, a hospital exec will have a 360 evaluation done where there will be an interview not only of the executive, him or herself, but also of the senior leadership team, indirect reports, board members, and the medical staff to get a wide variety of perspectives about the CEO's performance areas, both those that have been successful and those that are in need of work. And so your participation as a board member, or for that matter, if you're on staff and you're identified to fill out a questionnaire or go through a telephone interview with an evaluator, the more information you can give and the more candid that information you can give, the better a chance you have of strengthening the CEO's position in the organization and helping him or her be successful on your behalf for the hospital and the community. Make sure expectations are always spelled out in advance and involve all board members in collection of information, as we said. The next function is to ensure effective organizational planning. And every board member needs to be involved in strategic planning. One of the reasons why a board member is placed on the board is because they represent the community or some portion of the community that the hospital needs to hear from, that the hospital needs to benefit from the experience of in order to be successful. And that diversity in a board could be anything from yes, ethnic or racial, but you also have geographic diversity, you have age diversity, you have professional diversity, gender diversity. There are lots of ways a board can be diverse, and each of those people on that board needs to contribute their best efforts to help make planning successful. And everyone needs to be an active participant. Encourage the development of a board committee structure. You don't want the full board doing the entire work of the organization. If you can have committees, such as a finance committee, a governance committee, an audit committee, doing some of the work so that the board can be freed as much as possible to focus on strategy and focus on long-term rather than getting bogged down as a full board in operational issues. Set evaluation benchmarks as part of the strategic planning process. It's good to know what you want to be when you grow up, which is what I call strategic planning is, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, it's good to have some benchmarks to say, are we on the right path? Are we getting there? If so, great. If not, why not? And keep the plan up front and driving organizational decisions, because there's a temptation to take a strategic plan and first off treat it as a document, which it really isn't. We can talk about that later, but take that strategic plan and say, okay, well, thank goodness we've gone through that strategic planning exercise. Now we don't have to think about it anymore. Now we can get back to doing our real work. And if your real work isn't contributing towards satisfying the goals and the mission as identified in the strategic plan, then either your work is off track or the strategic plan is off track. And there needs to be an alignment that happens between those entities. And as a board member, it's your job to point out saying, well, why are we doing this if this isn't part of the plan? And then ask good questions and demand good answers. The board ensures adequate resources. This is a fun one, not so much for hospitals, but for other types of nonprofits. The board isn't responsible for raising the money, but the board has the responsibility to know and understand the importance of all the key revenue sources. They can use their contacts and influence to attract donors and partners. They just have the responsibility to make sure that adequate resources are available for the organization to meet its mission and fulfill its strategic plan. And, that doesn't mean that they're supposed to write the biggest checks. The board member's role, yes, is to support the organization, but their main role is something different from that. But when it comes time for a capital campaign, yes, your board can be a very powerful ally, a very powerful tool in assisting in making that fundraising campaign successful. As a board member, you should ask for training materials. You should not expect that you're an experienced fundraiser just because you're a person who's been named to a board. And it's entirely reasonable to expect the staff, particularly the development director, the foundation executive, to provide training on how to be the best fundraiser you can be. Expect them to come up with the plan. How are we going to raise? Who are we going to raise from? What is our goal? What's reasonable timeline? What kinds of gifts do we take and what kind of gifts don't we take? Because there are some legalities associated with that. This is where a board member needs staff support and expert support, particularly if you're going after, money for that new surgical tower or new clinic, as opposed to just putting on a special event. And I shouldn't say just putting on a special event, because special events can be incredibly complex, and have their own issues. But, just in terms of event or fundraising goals, generally a building costs more than you can raise from a single event. But backing up a little bit, take responsibility to assure that current and projected revenues of the organization are stable and sustainable. Take a look at those cash flow projections, take a look at those budget projections, even going forward, more than a year. I know that things are very unpredictable in healthcare. We never know where reimbursements are going to be. And, goodness knows we're going through a pandemic right now, and that probably played havoc with everybody's budget. Both financial budget and personnel budget. But it's important that the board be kept abreast of, what the financial position of the organization is and is likely to be going into the future. And as a board member, you shouldn't become complacent. It's your responsibility to assure financial stability. And it's not just by raising money or writing a check. There may come a time, particularly when we talk about Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement, talking about Medicaid expansion and what impact that might have on hospitals. The organization may need you as a board chair or a board member to be a political advocate, quite frankly, to do some discussions with state legislators, with the governor's office, even potentially going to Washington. And presenting your perspective as a volunteer leader about what legal changes and regulatory changes affecting healthcare, what effect that will have on your community and your hospital. So, there's more to assuring resources are available than just raising money. Sometimes it's looking at other revenue sources like government programs. So the next function is monitoring resources effectively. Take an active role in development and approval of the budget. Not everybody is a budget expert. Not everybody can read a financial statement. And you should develop that capacity and ask for help in developing that capacity if you don't already have it. It shouldn't be an embarrassing question to ask, because most of us aren't taught that in school. So, get a good understanding of what financial information is being presented and what it means. The threshold for this is getting regular access to information that is complete and accurate. Demand an external audit. Now, everyone in this audience, I'm going to assume, every hospital represented here gets an external audit every year. And one of the things that you should look at is how often you should change auditors. There are some people who say that you should have a different audit firm retained every 5 years, so that no single auditor gets too terribly comfortable with your hospital. The flip side of that is that the first year that a new auditor audits your hospital, it will be more expensive because they are learning your systems and your organization, and that costs a little bit extra. So it is an added cost. So there's a valid discussion to be had about how often you should change auditors. But definitely that auditor should be independent of your hospital and independent of its leadership. Similarly, expect a clear separation or segregation of duties within the organization. The same person who is cashing the checks should not be writing the checks. And the accounting systems should fairly reflect, all the accounting standards that are appropriate to, hospital operation. They don't call it GAAP anymore, but I forget what the new term is, but generally accepted accounting principles, but you should be running the books the way the books should be run. And then you manage reserve funds and formulate investment policy and strategy as a board. How many days of cash should you have on hand? What does cash flow look like? Can we afford to have an endowment? And if we don't have an endowment, why don't we? And what's the difference between an operating reserve and an endowment? What does it free us to do, and what does it constrain us from doing? Those are the kind of discussions that you should have as a board, and be looking to your CFO, your CEO to make recommendations about what the future cash position and financial position of the organization should be. How much debt should you carry and what types? Those are strategic issues, that the board should be aware of and familiar with. Then we get to programs and services, and hospitals have a peculiar interest here because there is quite legitimately a strong interest on quality because, we're talking about quite literally people's lives. Hospitals routinely deal with people's lives. And so there are all kinds of quality issues that lay on top of or across from what every other nonprofit thinks of in terms of programs and services. But the board is responsible for oversight to make sure that programs and services are delivered appropriately and delivered well. Good quality, appropriate quantity, and done, in a way that delivers value both for the patient as well as for the community and for the hospital itself. So you have to balance the handling of critical finance and fundraising issues with important discussion of mission programs and services. A lot of times there is no single one answer, right answer, wrong answer. It's a balancing act where you have to make choices. And the danger is you can get caught up in day-to-day affairs of financial survival at the expense of program planning. It's very easy to say, should we do X instead of Y? Can we afford to go to a new EMR? And if we go to a new EMR, what does that mean for bringing on additional providers? And those are those are discussions as well as decisions that will bubble up to the board level because they have a major impact on budget. And as I said a little while ago, ask the right questions and expect good and complete answers. I had a friend of mine who was a board member at what was then Sioux Valley Hospital. This was a long time ago. And he said that he had a bit of a reputation as a gadfly and kind of a burr in the saddle of the other board members and the leaders. But he said, my role in the boardroom is to ask good questions and even the uncomfortable questions, because if I can't get good answers inside the boardroom, then the hospital's leaders aren't going to be able to give good answers outside the boardroom when the media start asking questions, when funders start asking questions, when other people start asking questions. So I become kind of a quality filter inside the boardroom. So I ask good questions because the answers need to be there for later on when people other than I are asking those questions. And I said at the bottom here, request written summaries of each program at least annually. Make sure reports include annual comparisons, key service areas. One of the real keys that any organization can have, including a hospital, is to have a good brief summary of what is it that we do. And not just do it in jargon, but do it in terms that a typical community member could understand. Because that makes it a lot easier for a board member to have a discussion across the fence or at coffee and say, well, why is it that it costs so much to do X, Y, Z? Why is it the hospital's building a new building? Why is it that we need a hospital that has this many docs and this many services? Well, it's really easy to have that conversation if you're prepared with a simple explanation. And even the most complex issues often can have simple explanations, whether it's healthcare finance or healthcare access, or what kinds of services are provided. If you can give good information to your board members can be your ambassadors in the community and help deliver the message in a credible and accurate way. So enhancing the organization's public standing, as I said, be an ambassador, advocate, and community representative for the organization. As a board member, you're representing the community to the hospital as much as you're representing the hospital to the community. It's interesting when the U.S. State Department does its foreign service exam and aspiring diplomats take the exam, they're often surprised to realize that most of the questions that they're being asked aren't about foreign countries, they're about the United States. The more I know about my home, the better I can represent my home when I go abroad. And those are going to be among the first questions I'm asked by people as I go abroad. Well, similarly, the more you know about your hospital as a board member, the better you're able to represent the hospital to the community. And so it's really a two-way relationship that a board member has. Ask for the tools you need to feel comfortable. The board chairperson is the primary spokesperson for the board. The board chairperson is literally the first among equals. All board members have the same authority and same responsibility, the same liability, but the board needs to speak with one voice. And typically it's the board chairperson whose voice that is, outside the boardroom. But that doesn't mean you don't speak up. You do speak up in board meetings if you have concerns about how the organization is being presented. That's when you think of my friend from the Sioux Valley board saying, well, yeah, I'm going to speak out if I think it's wrong, but I'm going to speak out inside the room. But outside the room, the board speaks with one voice. And if you're a board member who feels ethically challenged or feels legally challenged by how the organization is doing its work, then you have to think about whether your service on that board can continue. That's when you think about resigning from a board. It's not the time to go out and complain and say, well, those other yahoos voted to do such and such, but I think they're wrong. That's improper conduct by a board member. But it's entirely proper for a board member to say, my ethics are being challenged, or I believe there's something going on here that could get the organization in legal trouble, and I've tried to fix it and I can't. Now's the time when I need to resign, need to consider resigning. And those are some very complex conversations. And I've been involved in some of those from time to time where, a board member will go to their attorney to ask for advice, and their attorney will call me in and say, they know the legal side of things, but what it's like to, serve on a nonprofit board and what the rules are. Let's have a three-way conversation and try to puzzle our way through this. And finally, let's see here. Yeah, be sure that your communication with others is consistent with the board's stand on any issues. That's a really important piece. That what you communicate to the public should be what other board members are communicating to the public. So that way the public can trust what you say and trust the organization. If they get different stories from different people, they're going to wonder what the truth is. Function 9, the board ensures legal and ethical accountability. Everything from appropriate licensure, accreditation, and external measures. I say they have to be in place and they have to be followed. If you're not going to follow them, then you shouldn't have them. But if you're going to have them, you need to follow them. You actually need to maintain accreditation and qualify for accreditation. If you're going to be certified, then live up to what certification means. As a board member, you can ask, what are the benefits of licensure and accreditation? What do those mean for the hospital and ultimately for the community? What benefit does that bring to the patients and those who might become patients? Take time to review reports. You don't have to know everything in them. You don't have to proofread them for spelling errors, but it's good to know what's in the information. Not only because, the detail can matter, but also because you don't want to spend your board meeting talking about operational reports. That's one of the biggest downfalls of nonprofit boards and, including hospital boards, is that you spend all your time, looking at operational detail and you don't have any time to talk about strategy, talk about the long game, talk about building board leadership capacity, doing all those things that are unique to a board. The reason why an organization has staff, why it has consultants, why it has volunteers, is so the board can share the load and particularly offload a lot of the operational responsibility to others. And it's the board's job to oversee, not to be intimately familiar with all that detail. Build solid personnel policies, grievance procedures, and related systems. Conduct a full bylaws/governance assessment review and assure compliance. It's amazing how many organizations will, even established organizations of a certain size can't lay their hands on specific documents that are required, under federal law or under state law, or simply haven't taken a look at their bylaws. I've been to organizations that haven't updated their bylaws in 15 years. And sometimes they don't even know what their bylaws say. They've just kind of been making it up as they're going along. And that works until there's a problem. It's the old joke about insurance. You don't need insurance until you need insurance. And then when you need insurance, you need it really badly. If somebody challenges how your organization is being run or the acts of your organization, it's important to have the rules and to know what the rules are and say, yes, we're following our rules. And the last one is real important, particularly, in any organization, but we run across this in rural hospitals quite a bit, is board members end up getting involved in personnel issues because they have friends or neighbors who are employees of the hospital, and the employees will feel like they have been treated poorly, and they'll talk directly to a board member, and a board member will go to the CEO, or a board member will try to interfere or intervene. And the first question that I always ask in one of these situations is, say, well, does the organization have an employee grievance process? And has the employee followed the grievance process? Because usually the grievance process doesn't reach the board level unless there's a threat of litigation. So, at the point, has the employee gone through the chain of command before they went to the board member? And if they go to the board member, then what are the board members being taught to do by the board? How are we supposed to handle these things? So that we're not making it up as we're going along and potentially even creating a violation of labor law. So we have to be careful about how we handle those. But having the right processes and policies in place can really protect an organization and its board. And that's one particular area that I would stress. And finally, function 10 here is actively recruit, orient, and assess board performance. The board is really responsible for its own hygiene. And hygiene is, everything having to do with the operation of the board, the education and development of the board, board succession. All of those things are the responsibility of the board. Now, the CEO can be there as a resource to assist, but the board is really responsible for its own health. So you work to balance the board, as I talked about earlier. There are all kinds of diversity. And everything we talked about earlier about classification. Some of you may have used a board matrix to identify the skills and talents and interests and demographic characteristics of current board members, and where the gaps might be when you recruit new board members. Everything down to what term limits there are, if any. I'm among those who recommends term limits to balance what an old professor of mine called to balance stability with energy. So you have new blood coming in, to reinvigorate the board, while at the same time you have a basis of institutional knowledge to balance against that energy, that new blood. So you always want to recruit new board members that have differing viewpoints, perspectives, skills, and experience. You don't want a groupthink board where everybody thinks the same way, the right way, quote unquote, and agrees with everything. There's never any dispute, because you're not really demonstrating deliberation and thought if everybody shows up, either without an opinion or with the same opinion. Assure new board members get thorough board orientation. Create and support a strong board nominating / governance committee. And I really go for the governance committee model, where the governance committee is responsible for everything having to do with the health of the board, or health of the board, as an entity. Design a formal process for board self-assessment. We assess the CEO, we should assess the board the same way. Set goals for board leadership development. This sounds like special pleading, but I actually believe it's true. Use an external facilitator for self-examination and reflection of redirection of dysfunctional systems within board operation. Getting somebody with an external view not only gives you a fresh viewpoint based on experience and expertise, but what it also does is it takes the heat off of the people in the room. It's awfully hard for the CEO and awfully hard for the board chair at times to point out what the defects are, what the flaws are, what the weaknesses are, and how the board operates. Having a third party come in and acknowledge where the weak points are can be a big help to moving the conversation towards improving overall board function. So we've talked a lot about all kinds of things that are involved in board service, both nonprofit board service generically and hospital board service specifically. I see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Maybe we can handle those now. And if you have more questions, now would be a good time to bring them forward.
You bet. So the first question, Michael, is who should actually do the annual performance evaluation of the CEO?
Good question. Really, that should be a board function led by ideally the governance committee. As I said, I'm a big believer in the 360 evaluation process where a variety of constituencies are asked to weigh in on the CEO's performance from their perspective. And then the board is responsible for having those results. And ideally you have a third party doing the 360, so the results are anonymized. And you don't say, well, Joe said this and Frank said that, and Mary disagreed with everybody. You anonymize it and come in and say, well, these are the areas that people identified as being done well. These are areas that are identified as need areas. And sometimes you even have a thing where say, well, the docs really like the CEO, but the board members don't really feel like they know her very well. And it's amazing, sometimes a 360 eval will come up with those kinds of insights. But it really is it's a board function. And ultimately the entire board should be briefed on the CEO evaluation. The way to not do it is an organization I was on the board of many years ago, where the CEO would go out for cocktails with the board chair once a year at the annual meeting. And about 10 minutes of that time that the two of them spent together would be called CEO evaluation. And the two of them would have a brief conversation and say, well, how do you think I'm doing? I say, well, I think you're doing great. Well, good, let's order another round. That's how not to do a CEO evaluation, both because you haven't involved the entire board and also because you don't have nearly enough information and perspective to make an informed conclusion about the performance of that individual.
Great. The next question, is it necessary for a nonprofit to have a separate foundation in order to undertake fundraising activities?
Short answer is no. You can definitely, any 501c3, any public charity, identified by the IRS, can have a director of development, or, in universities, they will call them VPs of advancement. And you can go out and raise charitable gifts, and those charitable gifts are deductible just like charitable gifts to any other charitable organization. One benefit of having a separate foundation is if you have donors who wish to establish restricted gifts or endowments. There's a temptation that an operating charity has, and a hospital would be an operating charity because you operate programs and services. There's a temptation to take money and use it as you need it. And generally you need it sooner rather than later. If you're going to build a war chest of endowment monies and restricted monies, If you're going to do a planned giving initiative where you're going to have testamentary gifts coming in over the next 20 or 30 years, in those situations, a foundation can be very beneficial because the foundation can have a different, can have a related mission, but a slightly different mission. It's like, like the community foundations say, for good forever. We're raising money for good forever that will benefit the hospital. It's just the hospital is not going to get all the money today. They're going to get the benefit of investment proceeds. They're going to get the benefit of partial payment, now, and then other payment later on. And there becomes a legal separation so that the hospital isn't tempted to raid the piggy bank. So the downside of having a separate foundation is that it is a separate board of directors and often requires having a separate executive director. There are times when the CEO of the hospital is also executive director of the foundation. I don't recommend that because it's an inherent conflict of interest between two corporations, but it happens. But you don't need it. You don't need to have a separate foundation unless you're talking about doing long-term endowment or restricted giving. If you're just trying to raise money through special events, just trying to raise money to subsidize operations, program operations. I'm not talking about operation procedures in the OR. But if you're just trying to add to the bottom line on an annual basis, then you don't need a foundation for that. But if you're raising long-term money, maybe a foundation's a good idea and worth the time and expense that it would take to stand one up and maintain it.
Perfect. That is all the questions in the queue right now. So
let me add real quickly on the foundation side is that hospital foundations are also what the IRS calls related organizations. And there's even a particular type of related organization called a supporting organization. And there are three types of supporting organizations with varying levels of tie-in to, the mothership, so to speak. And you can have hospital board members who are also foundation board members. You can also have non-hospital board members who are foundation board members. It just depends on how you decide legally to set up the structure of the organization. So, if you're looking at setting up a supporting foundation for your hospital, it's definitely something to do some research on. I would imagine that AHA has some resources on that. I know I did a webinar for the American Society of Association Executives a number of years ago for 501c6, like business associations that were going to set up an educational foundation, and how you relate those two organizations with each other. So, it takes some research and probably takes some good legal and tax advice, to do it and set it up well. And it's not a snap decision based on, hey, if we had a foundation, we could go after a grant. That's usually a bad reason to set up a foundation, but it's entirely possible to do. It's just a research topic, for the CEO or senior leadership to take on before they make a recommendation to the board. So I hope I haven't completely confused people, but that's just kind of, sometimes those are the waters I swim in. But we've got a few minutes. Let's say, if you're a staff member who's sat through all this and you're kind of wondering, well, what's my relationship to the board and what should the board's relationship be to me? One thing I would say is that the only staff member who the board has a direct relationship with is the CEO. And everything else, yes, you may have contact with the board, but your chain of command goes through the CEO. And that's on balance probably a good thing because it's always better to have one boss than to have a dozen. And A board member can come to you and ask for advice. They can ask for data. But outside the boardroom, that board member is just a person. Okay. Now, they're an important person, they're a valuable person to the organization, but their authority as a board member exists when they are with the other board members meeting together. The exception to that is when the board member is specifically tasked by the full board with a particular project or a particular task. I know there was an example one time where a board member walked into a hospital CFO's office and wanted to see the employment contract for a former employee. And the CFO, had to explain, said, I can talk about it at the next board meeting. I can talk about it if the board has delegated you to do a project related to this and report back to them. Said, but I can't share contract information with you as an individual, even though you're a board member. I just can't do that because, not only does the organization require a certain amount of protection legally, but also in the case of an employment contract, that employee or former employee is entitled to legal protection. And so there are limits to what I can do, for you as a board member. And if you want it, we can both go to the CEO's office and we can talk about it, or we can get the board chair on the phone. But you really want to honor the chain of command if you're a staff person and say, yes, there are boundaries, and the board is very powerful, but the board's interaction with the staff is through the CEO, unless there's an exception to that, like, say, for example, a director of development being the board liaison to the fundraising committee. But that's something that is, specifically delegated by the board to that committee. And even so, it's the committee that's doing that work. It's not an individual board member. So the boundaries really benefit the employees, benefit the staff leadership of the organization, as much as they do benefit the board member and the organization as a whole. Rely on your chain of command when dealing with board members and recognize that, yes, they are powerful, but there are boundaries and that there is a process that protects you as well as protects them and protects the organization as a whole. And that's true even in very small organizations where everybody's on a first name basis and, worships at the same church and shops at the same grocery store. There are still boundaries that are beneficial for everybody involved. So that's one point that I wanted to make, along the way. Are there any last minute questions? Any other issues that you want to cover? Now's a good time to type in a question or, raise your hand or however you do that.
Well, Mike, while we're waiting for any last minute questions, I'd just like to share with the group too that SDAHO has a variety of resources related to trustee education. Actually, on our website, we have a trustee resource center that's just dedicated to all board governance education. And so I just wanted to share that with you. It's actually SDAHO.org, and then there's a trustees site. And there is a password protected page, but if you are interested in some of the modules in education, you can simply send me an email and I can get you that password, because every SDAHO member does have access to that. So, and it's through the Govern Well Resource Center. So just wanted to share that with the group as well.
Great, thank you. And I just want to say that if anybody has any questions that they want to follow up with me personally about, I am very willing to speak with you by phone or by Zoom or correspond by email. I know there are some questions about board governance that can be kind of private and personal, and people want to remain anonymous, among a group, and I understand that. So, here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out and just mention that you are a participant on this webinar. And as I said, if you signed up for the webinar, I'll be sending you a copy of the slides So you'll have those for reference later on. So I just want to thank everybody for being here for this. And, from the numbers, it looks like not only do people stick around, but we actually picked up some people along the way. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's right. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Michael. And for those two on the call, I will be sending out the recording as well, because we would like you to especially share it with your governing board in the event they weren't able to attend a live session. And so we'll make sure you get the recording as well. So thank you, Michael, for your time today. And I believe we reconnect on April 22 for conflict of interest. So
Looking forward to it.
yes, yes.
Now that's a 30-minute session, isn't it?
Yeah, so yep, we're gonna put a lot of information into 30 minutes, I have a feeling, but
Okay.
um,
Well, that's,
it
yeah,
is.
that's really important stuff for board members, for trustees to know. So I'm looking forward to that opportunity. Thank you.
Yep, same here. Thank you. And with that, everybody have a great day. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.